Welcome to another science adventure with Tom Kay. Before we get into the paper that we just had published today, I'd like to talk a little bit about scientific journals, how they're ranked, how the authorship works, and whether or not you can deem them a reliable source of information. In order to get your scientific research published in a scientific journal, it has to go through a process called peer review, where the paper is looked at by other people in the field and they give comments and criticisms. Sometimes it means they don't think the paper is worthy of being published. Other times they think it needs minor revision, and extremely rarely they say it's good to go as is. Now, the quality of peer review can be different among different journals. With all of the information going around about the COVID virus, many times in the news you'll hear them referring to a journal such as the New England Journal of Medicine. And when you hear that, you sort of think, okay, that must be an important place where this information has been published. Well, there's actually a ranking system that ranks journals. And the ranking system is based on how many times each of the articles in these journals is referred to by other scientific works. So when you go to publish a paper and you want to say something like the sky is blue, you can't just say that. You have to refer to a previously peer-reviewed work that proved that the sky was blue. So what I'd want to say is, well, the sky is blue because Johnson 1999 did this study and they determined that the sky is blue. Now it seems obvious, but this is the way science works. You have to tie things into a larger peer-reviewed structure to get credit. Now, the number of times that a paper gets cited, so when I refer back to a paper to prove the point the sky is blue, that's called a citation. It's a reference, is the descriptive term. A citation is what happens when it's actually written down in the paper. Now, if we keep track of the number of citations for a particular paper, you can imagine that a very important paper will get many citations, and one that's not very serious or not taken seriously by the community will not get very many citations at all, if any. So the journals will try and pick papers that they think will be very impactful and generate a lot of citations. So each journal is given a score based on how many average citations each paper in that journal gets. So there's a slight technical difference between the two words citation and references, but for the purposes of this discussion, the two are essentially the same. So what we now know is that citations count in a paper. So the scientific community keeps track of the citations for each paper, and the journals also keep track of how many citations on average they get for all the papers in their journal. So some journals are very, very picky about the types of papers they accept for publication in their journal. Other journals, not so lucky, they kind of take what comes along. And the way you can determine this is you can look up online and see, on average, how many references per article a particular journal gets. Now, in the general science community, this is not the medical community I'm talking about here. If you're writing about lions and tigers and bears and things that grow in the sea or bacteria or things like that, the two highest level, the highest ranking journals are Science and Nature. Now, to give you an idea, most of the journals of the papers that we've published before and you've seen on previous videos are ranked anywhere from about 5 to 12, being very high. But in the case of Nature and Science, these two journals basically blow them out of the park. So this average number of citations is called impact factor. And for Science, the second highest journal, its impact factor is 20. And for Nature, their impact factor is 24. So as you can imagine, getting into Nature and Science is very hard. Now, some people will say it doesn't matter. Other scientists will try their whole life to get a paper in Science or Nature, and it may never happen. But I can tell you, when scientists are talking to other scientists, They will say things to each other like, oh, that person got a Nature paper. And that has a little bit of cachet to it. So it's quite the effort to do that. For instance, in the dinosaur world, Nature will only publish 3, maybe 4 dinosaur papers a year. So you are one of many. And they will reject probably 95 to 98 papers for every 2 to 5 that they accept. So very difficult to get in there. So when you do, it's a big deal. So if you want to look up how prestigious a journal is, look up the journal's impact factor. And that will tell you the average number of citations that journal gets per article published. The second aspect of interpreting a scientific publication I want to talk about is the list of authors. And this can be very telling. In the old days, it was quite common to see a single author on a scientific paper. Today, that almost never happens. It's actually quite a feat to get a single author paper. Most science these days is very collaborative and requires input from multiple scientists. So when you look at an author list, what does that tell you? So the first thing you look at is you see how many names are on the author list. And recently there's been a push toward anyone that contributes data to a paper gets put on as an author. As opposed to back in the 50s and 60s, you had to be able to defend the paper, so you had to know enough about it to speak intelligently about all aspects of it before they let you on the paper. So they're a little more diplomatic about it now. You can get on a paper for contributing various forms of data and without having to know exactly everything that's going on in the whole paper, which is good because many papers are very sophisticated these days. So you'll see a list of authors, and this tells you stuff. If you're looking at Nature kinds of papers, the first author on the list of authors is the one that led the charge, usually writes the paper, and is the big cheese on the team. There's then a pecking order after that that tells you how much contribution each author had. So the author at the end is the guy that contributed the least. That's except if you're looking at biology. In biology, for some reason, they started doing the last author is the most important author. Theoretically, that is the advisor, or something that's monitoring the students, so the student can have the first author position, and then the advisor can have the last author. So looking at various Nature papers that deal with the natural sciences versus biology, first author is most important, and then how it's ranked. Now, there have been some papers that have over 1,000 authors on them. Some of these nuclear physics papers require a lot of authors, and there'll be more pages of authors than there are pages of the science. But that's kind of rare. So very typically, it's 3 to maybe 12 to 15 authors will give you a very typical thing. By looking at the number of authors, you can see the scale of the publication. So if you see only a couple of authors and they're not widespread, they're from the same university, that kind of tells you this was a kind of a localized research project. If you see a dozen authors and they're from multiple countries and they all have different disciplines, you can pretty much bet that this was a very multi-level, wide-ranging, multidisciplinary project. Also, the more authors you have on a study, generally you can start to think that this many people wouldn't put their name on this paper if it wasn't a legitimate paper. So that's the way to look at authorship. There is a third factor in authorship called the corresponding author. Now, in some circumstances, there'll be some politics going on, and somebody may have to be placed as a first author that had something going on that allowed them to be in that position. But they're not really the person that everybody should talk to, that the media should talk to, and that. So there's a kind of lesser known authorship called corresponding author. And that's the author that's got all the brains. And if you have a question, you need to talk to him. If you're the media, you call them and you ask the questions of that person, and he'll have the most, generally speaking, have the most knowledge, the broad-based knowledge about the paper. So the corresponding author is usually buried in the text somewhere. But for those of us in the know, if you see a corresponding author that's different from the first author, then you know who the real brains of the operation is. So keep that in mind. So now that you know how scientific publications are ranked and how the authorship works and what you can glean from that list of people in the authorship, should give you a pretty good idea of how to look at papers. And generally speaking, the same applies for medical papers too. So if you look at the ranking, that can tell you a lot. So I told you all this because tomorrow we're going to have a paper that comes out in Nature. So you can imagine I'm pretty excited about that. I'm not the first author. I'm part of a larger team, but it's an interesting story. It's not about fossils. It's about astronomy. So give me 24 hours and we'll have another video for you on that paper. Thanks a lot. See you soon.